All right, it's April 27th, 2025. It was John Gnodtke. I'm here to interview Bill Gnodtke about some of his early memories 6 decades or so ago in the state of Michigan campaigns and legislative politics. So just to start off, I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about how you got your first job with the campaign in Michigan politics.
Well, my mom was very involved in politics. She was on the Republican State Committee for the Congressional District. My dad was very active in the political process, and I got to know some of the legislators, our legislators down in Berrien County. And the year was 1966, and there was a U.S. Senate race, and I can't remember exactly how I first thought of going to work for a statewide campaign, but somebody asked me if I was interested in maybe going to work for a Republican congressman from up in Traverse City by the name of Bob Griffin, who was running for an open U.S. Senate seat. And through some connections that our local legislators had with a fellow who was a state senator, former state senator in Ionia County by the name of John Gnodtke, I was approached to see if I would be interested in going to work for Senator Griffin. And I went to Detroit and interviewed with John Gnodtke, who was a de facto campaign manager for the senator, and got hired to be, I guess, a jack of all trades. I drove the senator when he was in the state of Michigan. I did advance work. I worked parades and handed out brochures and bumper stickers. And we had a very small campaign staff. The headquarters were in Detroit, and the Pick Hotel, I can't remember the name of the first name of it, but it was a hotel in downtown Detroit, and Pick Fort Shelby, and a fellow by the name of Jack Huston, who had written for the Detroit News, was the press secretary, and kind of the all hands on deck guy was a fellow by the name of Keith Molin, who had been active in Republican politics. I mean, we were all in our late 20s, early 30s. And so I moved to Detroit, got a room in the YMCA on Jefferson Avenue, and eventually met a fellow by the name of Fred Grassman, who was the chief advance man for the Romney for governor campaign. And we got a place down on 2nd Avenue, 2nd and Pingree, a couple blocks up from Grand Boulevard, an apartment. And like I said, I was kind of a jack of all trades, did everything. We were such a small campaign, you did everything.
What stage in it was this? Like, were there primaries that
Oh
year?
yeah, there was a primary. The incumbent U.S. Senator, a fellow by the name of McNamara, passed away, and we had a very opportunistic situation where Governor Romney appointed Griffin then to be the U.S. Senator. And on the Democratic side, Mayor Kavanaugh from Mayor Detroit and former Governor G. Menon Williams were running in the Democratic primary, but we didn't have any primary of any substance.
So there's no real competitive primary on the
on the Republican side. We were skating into the general election.
But you joined early enough that you were nominally part of the primary era. What was the focus of the campaign at that point, if you knew that it was?
Well, we just, getting known. I mean, he was a congressman from Traverse City, had been very well respected in Washington, and he co-sponsored the Landrum-Griffin Labor Act. Landrum was a Democratic congressman from Georgia, and those were the days when people worked across the aisle to get things done. So, but we traveled all over, went to parades, we went to Republican events throughout the state, tried to hit every county. It was sometimes hard to do because he was a very conscientious individual and didn't want to take time off from failing to be in Washington to exercise his duties as a congressman. And so he would, as soon as the Congress was out of session, he'd fly into Detroit, and I'd pick him up at the airport, and we'd campaign over the weekends, and then he'd fly back down to Washington.
So during the week, were you just doing advance and prep work for visits?
Yeah, doing advance and prep work, and sending out campaign material. We had a campaign, quote, consultant, a fellow by the name of Bob Smalley, from a consulting firm out in San Francisco. It seems to me the name of the firm was Whitaker Baxter, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But it was just, all hands on deck, small crew. You did multiple things, and we didn't have the multi-million-dollar budgets, and we didn't have the $10,000 fundraisers. It was more of a people campaign with and fewer consultants.
What was there a role for the state campaign in coordinating or worrying about a U.S. Senate race, or were they more?
Well, no,
locally?
Governor Romney put a team together called the Romney Action Team, and he was the running for re-election, and Bill Milliken from Traverse City was the lieutenant governor candidate, and a fellow by the name of George Washington from Detroit was the Secretary of State candidate, and Larry Lindemer from Stockbridge was the Attorney General candidate, and then he really put together a great team. 64 was not a good year for Republicans, and quite a few Democrats got elected to Congress, and the 66 team consisted of a guy by the name of Gary Brown from Kalamazoo, who won, and Vanderjack from over on the lakeside, and Jack McDonald down in Oakland County, Don Regal, who ran as a Republican for Congress and defeated a Democrat incumbent, former Highway Commissioner Mackey, Phil Rupee in the Upper Peninsula. Those were all seats that turned Marv Ashe down in Ann Arbor. It was the Romney Action Team really. We swept everything. We swept control of the Michigan Senate. We tied, went, I believe, from 38 Republicans in 65, 66 as a result of the 64 election. We went to 55 in the 66 election for the Michigan House of Representatives.
So for the Senate, once the primaries were done and you had a Democratic candidate for the Senate race, are there things that are different now in terms of the interaction between the candidates, debates, the media involvement, or things like that stand out to you?
Yeah, one of the things that really played, I think, a very positive role in those campaigns is the papers actually had reporters assigned to to the campaign. And so the Detroit News had a reporter that was assigned to Bob Griffin, and they had a reporter that was assigned to G. Menon Williams. They had a reporter assigned to Romney. They had a reporter assigned to Zoltan Ferenczi, who was the Democratic candidate. And the News did, the Free Press did, the AP did, the UPI did, the Booth newspapers did. So everywhere you went, you had 4 or 5 reporters that followed the campaign. And as I remember, the Detroit papers actually ran daily reports on the campaigns written by those reporters. So I mean, it was a full-time coverage, and I mean, and then you had your opinion columnists that would write political articles in the papers. But it was that was one of the challenges. When you would be moving from place to place, I mean, sometimes we'd be staying in really out of the, almost, quote, out in the sticks. And we'd stay with supporters at their home. Well, where are these reporters going to stay? And they'd have to, we'd have to try to help them find accommodations in hotels or motels in areas and that. But it was full-time coverage.
In terms of the dialogue or the debate of ideas between the different candidates, I mean, in an era today where it's a bunch of sniping and social media or rumor leaking or feeding stuff to press, was there interaction between the candidates at any point, or was it?
Oh, we would meet at forums and things like that, but I don't remember the bitterness. You'd point out, quote, the differences and things like that, but not the rhetoric was not as volatile as it is today, and the money wasn't there to continually be on TV, and it was just a different era of campaigning.
You mentioned an out-of-state consultant. Was that more on messaging, or do you know what the focus
Well,
of
it was
that?
kind of overall campaign consulting. It was something that, as I remember, got set up out of Washington that they did consulting. I mean, there were political consulting firms, but certainly not to the volume that you have them today. I mean, this Bob Smalley played a role in the campaign, but boy, there was an awful lot of direction from John Stalin and the Romney people and the state party. Great relationship with the state party, and it really was a, quote, team effort back there in '66.
With campaign finance not being the behemoth then that it is today, I mean, was there some fundraising that you were involved with, or that there were people on the campaign staff, or were you just trying to get enough bare bones to?
Well, there was campaign. We would have fundraisers in local communities, but they were essentially run by locals. Very honestly, I mean, the amount of money was minuscule compared to what they spend today, and we had a bare bone, like I said earlier, we had a bare bone staff. We didn't really start. We added an assistant press secretary to help Huston. As I remember, it was after the primary, so that would have been for August, September, and October. We very seldom flew anywhere. It was driving, so you had to figure that into the time element, and when we went to the UP, that was a long haul. The bridge, thank God, was open, but when you're going, you wanted to say you've been all over the state, and it was just a different era of campaigning.
Do you have any recollections about what election day itself is like, or election evening as
Well,
results?
election day, we had a voter integrity effort, and
Was it called that at the time, or are you just using today's
I-
language for it?
I don't remember what
Okay.
it was called, but Fred and I were given a bunch of precincts to monitor, and then you would go, to observe were people being assisted in voting booths, and was their campaign material being handed out, and you had a number to call in case there was you saw anything, and it was pretty loose, let's put it that way. And Fred and I were going in some areas in Detroit that we weren't exactly familiar with, coming from Buchanan and Grand Rapids, and but it was so volunteer dependent. I mean, all of the counties had phone banks that were set up, run by individuals. It wasn't an effort run out of Lansing where you got 50 people on a phone calling. I mean, each little community had people that were calling and assisting people to get to the polls. And,
Was this something the county parties would coordinate, or?
well, it was kind of coordinated at the state level, and because, like I said, the Romney Action Team, everybody really worked together on that, and it was Governor Romney was. I mean, that man. He just never slowed down, and he had good people working for him, and the coordination between the campaigns was very. I mean, if we went into Flint, we did stuff with Don Regal, the governor. There were a series of Ask the Governor or something like that in different TV markets that the Romney campaign, the state party, put together. And a lot of it would be with Governor Romney, and then there would be a segment of, say if it was a half hour, there'd be 10 minutes with Griffin. And Romney was, of course, endorsing Griffin and telling people what a positive senator he'd be. And then there'd be a 5-minute segment with Don Regal and Romney, and it was quite an election day.
Was there polling internally, or that the parties were doing, that you were aware of, or?
I wasn't involved in any of that. No, I think, as I remember, the media did a little bit of polling, the Free Press or the news, but I don't remember ever sitting through a meeting where we went through polling data.
Obviously you weren't refreshing the internet for results that evening, but like what was the process for tracking the results as they were coming in, and when did you have a sense of what the results were going to be?
Well, as I remember, it went through the state party, and we were set up in one of the hotels downtown Detroit, and there would be constant. People would call in from the county chairs, would call in to Lansing, or call in to the Romney campaign or the Griffin campaign. I don't remember the inside way it was set up, but there would be calls from the counties coming in, and when they would get election results, and then it would be shared with everybody. I mean, it was a foregone conclusion, I think, that I know that Romney was going to win, and so that meant, okay, Romney and Griffin, or Romney and Milliken would be governor and lieutenant governor, because they ran on as a ticket, and then when you'd get the results in from Grand Rapids, and Jerry Ford was running away with it, and Bob Griffin was on his heels, not out polling Ford, but very, very close. And you knew that he was going to do very well in Kent County, and they kept adding the numbers up. And as I remember, we were pretty sure that Griffin had won sometime after midnight. And
so do you have after the election's over, did you have a sense of what your next step was going to be now that there was no campaign, or how did you
the campaign was over. I mean, we had a couple of vehicles. We had a motor home that we had leased from a Clark Equipment Company, and I had to return that back down to Battle Creek, and for about a week or 10 days, it was just mop up stuff at the headquarters and that, and then by Thanksgiving, it was what are you going to do next?
And so your next stint was in the legislative staff. How did you apply for, or how did you get into that role?
Well, I got to know some of the people during that campaign, and as I said earlier, the Republicans tied the Democrats at 55-55, and the Republican leader was a fellow by the name of Bob Waldron, and the Democrat leader was a fellow by the name of Joe Kowalski. And obviously they had the political agendas of the two parties and that, but they reached an agreement that the Republicans and the Democrats would have, quote, equal staff. And so there were some staff jobs available for the Republicans, because they only had one, and the Democrats previously had 5.
There was one legislative staffer for the entire minority House caucus.
For 38 Republican members of the legislature, there was one.
And was that a jack of all trades kind of position, or do you know what their role theoretically was?
I mean, he did everything. He assisted Waldron, who at the time was the minority leader, and he kept his eye on legislation. And if a legislator had a, quote, staff, couldn't have staff problems because there weren't any staff, and
so you said it went up to 5 under the new power sharing agreement.
We had we hired, I was a constituent specialist. We had an executive secretary, we had a press officer, and we had a legal officer, and then we had a person who dealt with legislation.
So when you say the constituent services, whatever, that was for all 55?
That was for the Republican caucus, yeah.
So if they're calling from Ishpeming, or if they're calling from Tecumseh, you're the...
Well, no, the call would go into the legislator's office, and if it wasn't something that the secretary, because at the time, as I remember, it was one secretary for 2 legislators. And
were those full-time, or those just session days?
No, they were full-time, okay. Which had only happened in recent years. Prior to that, they hired the secretaries only when they were in session. And but if a call came into a legislator's office and it wasn't something that the secretary could quote unquote handle, and it required more research or more follow through, it would come up to me, and I'd do it.
So was the hiring being done by Representative Waldron, or
hiring was done by Bob Waldron? Bob Waldron interviewed me, and I got hired. And my first day was in January in '67, and the legislature was tied 55-55, and Waldron had very good relationships with a Democratic state representative by the name of E.D. O'Brien, who was from the Detroit area. And O'Brien and the rest of his caucus didn't exactly get along that well together, and so they came up with this idea that they would change the rules, or they would have a vote on the rules of the House that would say that the Speaker would be elected by a majority of those present and voting. And ED voted with the 55 Republicans, so that carried 56-54. Then they had the vote for Speaker, and on the vote for Speaker, when they got to O'Brien's name, the Democrats demanded a voice vote, and when they got to ED's name, he just sat there. And they waited, and the clerk was a fellow by the name of Tom Thatcher, and Tom called his name 2 or 3 times, and Representative O'Brien never said anything, and so they went and completed the rest of the thing, and then they went back to O'Brien again, and he never voted. He sat in his chair, never voted, and the clerk, Tom Thatcher, who, by the way, was a former Democratic state representative from the Muskegon area, declared that Bob Waldron had been elected with the rules of the House, a majority of those present voting. And it was just a different environment back then. I mean, the Republicans were in control, boom, they kept Tom Thatcher on as clerk, because Tom was really a fair individual. I mean, he was the clerk. He wasn't the Democratic clerk or a Republican clerk. He was the clerk, and did a wonderful job.
So what did having the gavel, other than being able to, what practical effects did that have? I mean, they're still honoring the deals about equal staffing and things like that.
Well, no, but I mean, we were able to appoint the committees and the chairs, and then it wasn't too long after that Representative Kowalski passed away, and then there was a special election down in northwest Detroit, solid Democratic area, and the Democrats nominated a guy by the name of Jimmy Hoffa Jr., and the Republicans nominated a guy by the name of Tony Licata, and we won. And I mean, that was a classic case of people going door to door to door. I mean, there was no TV, there was no radio. I mean, it was just get out the vote. And they had a very good Republican organization in northwest Detroit, and special election, low turnout, and Tony won. Well, then we had a clear 56-54 majority. But that only happened, if I remember, in like March or April of 67. So
you mentioned the shared administrative support for every 2 members and the 5 caucus staff for each caucus. What other staff was around in terms of fiscal agencies or research divisions or business staff, or what?
Well, there was a Legislative Service Bureau on the 4th floor of the Capitol, and it consisted of, I don't know, 5 or 6 employees up there, but the attorney was a fellow by the name of Art Craig, and the director was a Democrat, Don Hohenschel. I mean, there was less partisan, throw all the Republicans out when the Democrats win, throw all the Democrats out when the Republicans win. I mean, it was more of a, okay, let's get the job done, and this person had done a good job previously, and they kept him on. And but there was no House Fiscal Agency. There was a Senate Fiscal Agency, and as I memory, there were 2 people on it. A guy by the name of Jerry Favorman, and I think the other guy's name was Bill Rogie. But as an example, the House Appropriations Committee, the chairman was a fellow from Traverse City, and his secretary was also the clerk for the Appropriations Committee. And the members did all our own research, and I mean, they didn't have staff to do all that stuff. And I mean, when the entire, I mean, just the difference in '67, the entire governor's office, lieutenant governor's office, secretary of state, attorney general, House, Senate, and Supreme Court were all in the state capitol building on 4 floors.
So the governor's ceremonial office there held the governor's staff at that point?
Oh yeah, but the governor's staff was relatively small. I mean, he had, you know, his own legal counsel, and he had staff people, but the governor's office was on the 2nd floor, and there was an office down on the 1st floor and an office down on the ground floor, and they were on the side that the elevator was on, and which, by the way, at the time had an elevator operator.
Wondering if that was a legislative employee too, or a...
No, the guy was there when I started, and he retired from there when they went to an automatic elevator. But
the legislative calendar or the session calendar at that point in time, how busy was that compared to kind of current days?
Well, I can't speak to current days, but the legislature came in on Mondays, and there was a Monday night session, and then they worked Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, and there was a Friday morning session, and then they'd go home after lunch.
When you say Monday night session, is that like late afternoon or into the evening? Or
as I remember, they'd go into session after dinner. I mean, you know, some of these guys, it was a long haul for the people in the Upper Peninsula to get down there, and
do you have a recollection of like how many weeks or how many, you know, vacation things where they would go home to the district for a couple of weeks, or the summer? Or...
I don't remember that. All I know is that they worked very hard, and they got things done. As I remember, in '67 or maybe '68, they got the State School Aid Act done by the 1st of June, so that, you know, when the negotiations were going on for teacher salaries over the summer, the school district knew how much money was coming to this school district and that school district, and I mean, we really got in the legislators really got in a tremendous amount accomplished in those days. You know, the riots were in 1967. That legislature passed fair housing legislation after the riots bipartisanly. Michigan was in a financial crisis. They needed revenue. That legislature passed the first state income tax in the history of the state of Michigan bipartisanly. The courts needed to get done. We had a justice of the peace. The court reorganization was accomplished by a Republican rep by the name of Don Holbrook from Clare, and Bob Traxler, who eventually became the congressman from Bay City, sitting down on the House floor every night, rewriting the Michigan court statutes. I mean, an incredible amount of work got done in a bipartisan nature down there. I really have a hard time remembering how many, you know, 56, 54 votes there were. And I mean, none come to memory except, you know, the election of the speaker, as I've already spoken to. But it just was a different era.
You've talked about kind of the way that the legislators would be when they were in Lansing for that week, and just sort of how they organized socially.
There was a lot of camaraderie. I mean, the Republicans stayed across the street at the Jack Tar, which is now where the governor's office is across the street there. And the
Was that
Democrat,
entire building the hotel, or was it?
it was a hotel, yeah,
Romney building
restaurants
was-
on the first floor, and it was a bar on the first floor, and a breakfast place, and then another restaurant that served meals at lunch and at dinner. And the Democrats stayed north of the Capitol there on what was called the Roosevelt Hotel. And, you know, people did things together. I mean, they didn't stay in apartments. They didn't buy condominiums out in Grand Ledge or in Okemos or whatever. Everybody was kind of stayed downtown. And so, you know, legislators would go out, have dinner together. I mean, there was always, some things never change. I mean, there was always somebody, a lobbyist, ready to take you out to dinner, I guess. But in those days, there weren't any in 67, 68, 69, 70, there weren't multi-client lobby firms. As I remember, in the early 70s, you started to see the development of former Democrat state rep by the name of Jim Carub from Highland Park started Carub Associates, and former Senate leader Emil Lockwood from, I think he was from Alma, and a fellow by the name of Jerry Coombs started Public Affairs Associates, and so you started getting these more powerful lobby firms then. But in the old days, you know, Chrysler had a lobbyist, GM had a lobbyist, Ford had a lobbyist, the Medical Association had a lobbyist. They were all individual lobbyists that came to town.
They were more coming to town and not like a local office of the Manufacturers Association or.
Oh, there was a state chamber, but the state chamber did their own lobbying. There was a Michigan Manufacturing Association; they did their own lobbying. Michigan Manufacturers Association, the head of that was a fellow by the name of George Van Prusen, who'd been either a former rep or senator, a Republican. The head of the chamber was a fellow by the name of Harry Hall, and to the best of my knowledge, he'd never served in the legislature. But you know, there weren't big buildings like the chamber. The chamber had a small office over on the corner across the street from the Michigan National Tower, or I guess it's called the Boji Building now.
You talked earlier about kind of the shoestring budget for the Senate campaign. In terms of like focus on fundraising or any of that as it's developed these days, I mean, was that geared towards?
Emil Lockwood, when he was a Senate leader in '66, and Bob Griffin and Bob Waldron started something called the Republican Legislative Dinner, and there used to be a place called the Civic Center across the street over by the other side of the post office there on Walnut, and boy, it was big dollars. It was $100 a ticket and $125 a couple, and that's where essentially the Republicans raised their money, and you had one of those a year,
and that was the whole floor of the convention center there, or the Civic Center?
It's set up into basketball. You know, there was a basketball court there on the ground floor, and you'd set the tables up in there, and it was a catered event, and we'd get speakers in. I mean, we had some rather good speakers. Kit Bond was a senator from Missouri, and Nelson Rockefeller came in and spoke. But it was the campaign that I referenced earlier, Hoffa campaign, as I remember, Tony's campaign was completely run on less than $2,500.
For a control-seeking
which determined control of the Michigan legislature. I mean, but that was $1967 too.
Well,
but I mean,
you're talking low five figures adjusted for inflation.
Well, I don't know what the adjustment in 2025 would be dollar amount, but I mean, you know, you could send a letter, I think, for a nickel and get out the vote postcards for 3 cents or something like that. So,
what was the you mentioned some of the press corps and their involvement in campaigns? Was it some of those same staff that were the press corps that were covering legislative affairs during the week?
Well, yeah, but you know that the press had a desk on the floor of the Michigan House. As you're facing the podium, they were on the left-hand side, and there was a House press office that was run by a state employee or a legislative employee. My memory, Eddie Augenstein, and the news had a desk back there, the Free Press, AP, UPI, everybody, and I mean, they were right on the floor, and over in the Senate, it was essentially the same thing. Although, as I remember, there was only one press office, and that was the one behind the House, and but there was such, you know, the Booth newspapers, they had a reporter from the Bay City, one from Flint, one from Ann Arbor, one from Kalamazoo, I mean, one from Grand Rapids. There was a huge presence on the legislature. I mean, they ran columns every day.
I think that's kind of the questions I had prepared for kind of you coming into this process in the 60s in your role. Is there anything else that's on your mind that didn't touch on or just of interest?
No, it's just, I think the most thing that was overriding in my mind was the cooperation and the willingness to work across the aisle between the caucuses. I mean, there were some partisan issues. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But you know, to be able to take on fair housing after the riots, to be able to enact a state income tax for the very first time in the history of the state, and to reorganize the courts. I mean, those today, I would hate to see the debate on something like that today. And the other thing that I think is that there was a lot more access for the person on the street as to what was going on in Lansing, because it was covered so extensively by the written media. You didn't need to understand how to operate an iPad or a phone, or everybody picked up and held in their hands the paper. But the papers were really thick. I mean, and there was full coverage every day of what was going on in the legislature. And I don't see that today, very honestly.
Did your role in terms of dealing with constituents, was that more just about, because I think of today, you get a lot of people who participate just by like forwarding some story or liking or retweeting something. So there's a lot of noise sometimes on issues, but like what was the input route for citizens? Were there a lot of letters on issues that you were getting?
Yeah, mostly it would be, if it was something that was of an emergency, there would be a phone call and you'd try to take the information, but it usually, at least with my job, it got relayed from a legislator's office. The public didn't know who Bill Gnodtke was or who the constituent relations person was. but they knew how to get a hold of their legislator. And then, as I said earlier, if it was something that really required more work than something that the secretary could answer or forward to the right place, that would come to me. But it just, you know, as I said, the place wasn't overrun with employees, and you didn't get on hold, or you didn't get, can't come to the phone right now and leave a message. And I mean, staff was expected, if there was a call, to answer that phone. And two reps would share a secretary, and one secretary would leave at 11:30 to go to lunch and switch the phone over to another secretary, so that if the call came in to Representative A, whose secretary was having lunch, it would go over to Representative B's office, and she would answer the phone for both offices. And then she would take her lunch at 12:30 to 1:30, and she'd switch her phone over to A. And it was all hands on deck, because they just didn't have a lot of people.
You mentioned an income tax getting introduced, which today, debates over increasing the income tax by 0.1% or 0.2% can create a lot of heat and firestorms and people against or for. Was there any kind of public outpouring of thoughts on the issue? Any organized opposition?
Well, I mean, in the Republican caucus, we had 5 or 6 Republicans that just absolutely and positively would not vote for it. And so, I mean, that necessitated, dialogue across the aisle. And then, there were enough, quote, responsible legislators on both sides of the aisle that realized what the consequences would have been had they didn't have the revenue. And Romney was very involved in it, and it was just a different era.
All right. Well, I really appreciate that, and maybe we'll see if there's a volume 2 at some point.
Okay.
Thank you.